All right. So for you early 90s pop music fans out there, we're not on a movie theme today, we're on a music theme. So we're going to talk at the end about that classic CNC Music Factory hit, Things That Make You Go, hmm. So first, want to talk a little bit about Hong Kong. So a couple of people have reached out to me asking about Hong Kong and what's happening there and how to explain a place that had excellent control over COVID-19 up until now, suddenly kind of losing it. So you can see a lot of reports in the media recently about a remarkable number of cases for Hong Kong. And also the fact that their hospitals are now overwhelmed. They're actually running out of mortuary room. They've been talking about actually converting schools to temporary morgues because they are running out of space to store fatalities from the COVID epidemic that's raging. You can see at the bottom left some of the statistics. So, a rocket-like trajectory that we've seen previously in places that have experienced an Omicron wave. And this appears to be Omicron BA2, right? So even potentially more transmissible than the original BA1 version of Omicron that hit the US. I think a couple of things to point out, though, and we'll look on the next page about perspective in terms of Hong Kong and what's horrible for Hong Kong in terms of case numbers is not necessarily equal to what other countries have experienced. So yes, clearly they have a huge outbreak that is well beyond anything they've experienced. But if you look at the number of tests that they're running, they are testing well above almost any other country has done. So if you see there on the top right graph in that Our World in Data quad chart, they have about over 2.5% of their population being tested every single day now. In contrast, the US had a few weeks where we got above 0.5% per day being tested, but that was under the extraordinary circumstances of the peak of the Omicron wave. So they're testing at a much higher rate than we ever did, and certainly most other countries. And you can see their positivity rate reflects that, where they are still below 1% test positivity. Now, if you look at their absolute numbers, or at least numbers on a population corrected scale, they are still well below where we were for the Omicron wave, even taking into account that they're testing again at a rate 4 to 5 times what we did. And so their case ascertainment is certainly much higher than ours was in the US. They are now approaching daily case counts that we saw with our Delta wave, as you can see there in kind of the late summer, early fall, and getting close to what we saw at our previous peak before Omicron, which was the winter wave of 2020, 2021 that we see there in the December to February timeframe of last year. So their case counts are approaching previous highs that we've seen, but nothing compared to what we saw with Omicron. And again, you have to take into account that their case ascertainment is higher. So that curve that we see for the US probably should be at least 2 to 3 times higher than it is compared to Hong Kong. However, what's interesting is that their deaths, their daily count of deaths is now approaching what we saw with our previous Delta wave and is going to, I think, eclipse what we even saw, or at least come close to what we saw with our deaths per capita in the prior wave and again, December, February timeframe of last year. So what this means is there's essentially no decoupling in Hong Kong between what their expected death count is given their current case count. As a matter of fact, they're about what the US experienced with its previous waves, particularly last year, but also the Delta wave. So why is that when Omicron is so much milder, right? Omicron is, we've heard, it's a mild virus. It causes mild disease. Well, that's only the case when you're talking about a population that has no pre-existing immunity, or the mild nature of Omicron is only the case when you are talking about a country or a population that has pre-existing immunity. So let's look at what the prospects for immunity are in Hong Kong. They're actually very poor. So first of all, almost nobody in Hong Kong has been infected with COVID-19. As you can see here, in the US, by official case counts, we're up around 25% of the population having had a COVID infection by this point. In Hong Kong, you can see that that is 20-fold lower, even more. So a very small proportion of the population, certainly less than 2%, and probably significantly less than that, probably less than 1% if you look here, has had a COVID-19 infection. So they have almost no immunity from previous infection. They also have a large proportion of highly susceptible, vulnerable people. So you can see that the US, as we know, is one of the leaders in deaths per capita from COVID, unfortunately. And so a large number of people in the US, about 280 for every 100,000, have died of COVID-19. And 80% of those, as we know, are people over the age of 65. So a significant chunk of the most vulnerable that we have in our population, unfortunately, have already died from COVID-19. That population is still alive and susceptible in Hong Kong. The other thing that's important to note is between vaccination and infection in the US, almost everybody has had some exposure to COVID-19 and therefore has some level of immunity. As you can see, even our national surveillance systems that are looking at blood donors, for instance, from the CDC, tell you that about 95% of the population of the US are estimated to have antibodies against COVID-19. So that's either from prior infection or from vaccination. So essentially, everybody in the US has either been infected or vaccinated or both. So we have a very high level of background population immunity. Now, it's not enough. This is before the Omicron surge, correct? Right. This is from December. So we can see that even before Omicron, and we've talked about this before, essentially we had achieved what people thought would be herd immunity. But again, obviously doesn't cut it when you're talking about variants that drift significantly from their prior generations of virus. So in the US, everybody has some type of immunity. In Hong Kong, very few people have underlying immunity because their infection rate has been very low and their vaccination rate is actually pretty poor. Now, if you look at it just in general numbers, it doesn't look as bad, right? Hong Kong looks like they have, 69% of their population fully vaccinated. That's pretty close to the US. In fact, a little better than what the US is. It's 65%. They're lagging behind a bit in third doses or boosters, so people who are up to date. And sorry, I said fully vaccinated, and I've tried not to do that because obviously 2 doses is not fully vaccinated, and we should not argue or label it as such. It is completing a primary series. So fully vaccinated, you can see in the US, is 3 doses, and that's 28% of the population. Hong Kong a little bit behind at 20%, but you wouldn't think that would be so bad. But look at the age distribution in the US, and this is the important differential. So in the US, we've actually done a pretty good job of vaccinating our most vulnerable. Remember, 80% of the fatalities have occurred in people age 65 and older. And we've achieved a 2-dose series in almost 90% of that population and have fully vaccinated almost 60% of those, right? So up to date in vaccines, 3 doses, almost 60% of our seniors age 65 and older have achieved that mark. Not bad, right? So we've done a better job of protecting the most vulnerable. Obviously, even there, we've achieved massive numbers of deaths and hospitalizations in Omicron. That's a different story. But in Hong Kong, it's a very different story. Their maximum vaccination rates are in middle-aged adults. As you can see, age 40 to 49. And when you get to age 60, and especially to age 70, they're falling below 60% of even completing a primary series of vaccine. And then if you look at the vaccines that they're using, they've had difficulty getting enough mRNA vaccine, essentially Pfizer. BioNTech is the mRNA they've used. So many of their doses, probably 40% of their doses that they've given, and that continues to be the case, are Sinovac, which is the Chinese inactivated whole virus vaccine, which we know has dramatically inferior immune protection compared to Pfizer. So not only do they have a very small number of their seniors who are completed a full series or a primary series, But most of them, or at least many of them, were vaccinated with a significantly inferior vaccine. So their level of immune protection, particularly among their most vulnerable over the age of 60 to 70, is quite low. And then I didn't include, there was a graphic that looked at the boosting as well, and the boosting rates are equally low. So if you think about it, if only 58% of their over the age of 70 have completed a 2-shot series, and obviously it's dramatically lower for those in that age group who've achieved 3 shots. So their senior population is much, much more vulnerable. And this is due to a significant factor of distrust among seniors in Hong Kong about the shots. And this is not necessarily the same phenomenon as many of the anti-vaccine sentiments and misinformation products in the US. You can argue that the seniors among Hong Kong residents, particularly those who were old enough to have lived the majority of life under essentially a free Hong Kong, not under the reign of China, as happened in the 1990s, probably have a very different perspective on the Chinese government and the vaccines that Chinese government is distributing compared to younger residents of Hong Kong. And thus we can see the significant difference in demographics in terms of who's been vaccinated. So this explains to a large extent all of these things I've talked about in terms of immunity, why Hong Kong is having such a tough time. Previously a place that did incredibly well in maintaining low levels of virus transmission. But without vaccine imparted immunity, it is essentially almost impossible to control Omicron, especially in a place that has one of the highest population densities of anywhere in the world. I think Hong Kong is second or third, if you consider it its own country in terms of population density. So this problem of mistrust of government is something we've talked about before. You can argue that that's probably more well-founded in Hong Kong than almost anywhere else, but it is a significant factor in what's affecting them now. So as we get onto that theme of misinformation and disinformation and how that's undermined trust in government and trust in the vaccines and the public health response, it brings me to that thing that makes you go, which is an interesting observation that I believe he's a grad student looking at analytics of social media posts over the last week or so was able to dig up. So this is analyzing on Twitter posts that have the hashtag myocarditis, which obviously are almost all about myocarditis from the COVID-19 vaccine, and tracking those numbers over time. And you can see that over the several days leading up to February 25th, there were around 500,000 posts per day that were referencing hashtag myocarditis. You can see this is cumulative numbers here, but all of a sudden on the 25th, there's a flat line, right? No additional traffic for over a day on hashtag myocarditis. So essentially all of those tweets stopped. Interesting. Also, if you looked at hashtag COVID-19 vaccine and hashtag Trudeau must go, which is obviously a dig at the Canadian Prime Minister, and there's been a significant amount of traffic around him and his opposition to the Freedom Truckers protests in Canada, again, that revolve around COVID-19 vaccine. Interestingly, all of these had a significant lull of essentially almost no activity on Twitter with these hashtags for over a day. And that time period was started around the 24th and 25th of February. Now, for people who've been keeping up with recent news, there was a significant event that occurred on the 24th in Eastern Europe, and that is when Russia invaded Ukraine. So one could imagine that the Russian bot farms that are active on social media probably were distracted, messaging more things around Ukraine than others, and also potentially disrupted as Western anti-cyber warfare forces took actions to potentially disrupt Russian disinformation that was an important component of their assault on Ukraine. So I'm sure just a coincidence that during that period of time where there was significantly less Russian bot traffic, that these anti-vax messages seemed to disappear on Twitter. And there's probably no relation, but just an interesting observation that shrewd analyst made, and should make you think about these things if you are on your social media reading posts about anti-vax messages. You really should think about where those are coming from. That's all I have.